So Dune Awakening is an upcoming survival MMO, and while it'll have aspects of both a survival game and an MMO game, it will primarily be focused on being a survival game with MMO elements added onto that to make it feel like a much larger world, have a lot more players, have a lot more social features. Now, why this distinction is important is because survival games, especially these type of survival games, are usually pretty PvP focused. Games like Ark Survival Evolved or Conan Exiles, or even having some similarities to something like Rust. All of those more server-based survival games are still generally more focused on PvP, even though they can have PvE focused servers. But Dune Awakening also being an MMO means all of the different types of content are going to all be in one game and accessible at the same time. And the biggest reason I want to talk about this is because I've been seeing a lot of people thinking that you will have to be a PvP focused player, or you will have to take part in PvP to obtain, let's say, all of the better gear in the end game, or obtain all the different resources throughout the game. And that's just not going to be the case with how Dune Awakening is being designed. Now, before we go more into this, I do have to go over the general progression you're going to take after starting Dune Awakening, because all of the different maps or zones you'll be able to go to are actually going to have different gameplay rules, especially when it comes to PvE versus PvP. So in Dune Awakening, you're going to have like a 10 to 15 minute scenario after you create your character. This is just going to teach you some of the basics, going to give you some of the basic elements to start off. And then after you leave that, you're going to enter the place you're going to be for a good amount of time at the start of Dune Awakening, called Haga Basin, which is the first big zone you're going to be in. And once you leave that kind of starting scenario, you will be in a specific area of Haga Basin that's kind of like a lower level area. As you progress, you'll start to get to all the different parts of Haga Basin, and Haga Basin is pretty massive. It's the size of the Conan Exiles map. So this isn't going to be just like some small starter zone. This is going to be an absurdly large piece of gameplay area. The developers have said there's like 100 hours of content in this, but that doesn't also include farming up tons of additional resources constantly, or making more bases, or just general additional farming, which is things you would always be doing in survival games or MMOs. So that's just kind of the unique content, and that can give you some perspective on how much stuff is actually going to be in this initial play space. And one of the biggest things you need to know about Haga Basin, especially if you're somebody that's not going to want to PvP, is Haga Basin is primarily PvE. Pretty much the only PvP areas, or the only PvP areas that the developers have described so far, is that there can be these ship crashes. So you'll see a big ship come down and crash, blow up, and that'll create this shipwreck that you can go harvest resources from or try to obtain loot from. And some or all of those are PvP enabled. So you would see like a specific area around it that when you went into it, you're able to PvP other players. And that's the primary bit of PvP that's gonna be in Haga Basin. Pretty much everything else is PvE focused. Now, after you've been progressing into Haga Basin quite a while, you'll get to the point where you can make your first flying vehicle, the Ornithopter. And once you get this, that will allow you to go to the world map and travel to the different areas. Going to the world map turns into this kind of top-down view where you're just kind of flying a little Ornithopter to go to all of the different areas. Now, to start off, you have two social hubs, which are basically just big cities you can go to. The cities are going to be able to have a lot of players in them, but they're not combat-focused areas. You go there to go to the player auction, to pick up different objectives or quests, go talk to the different factions. These are just non-combat player hubs. Now, you can also travel to the player hubs before you get your own Ornithopter. You're able to talk to specific NPCs that will, for a cost, fly you to those early. So before you get your own Ornithopter, if you want to go to the player market and buy something from another player or sell something, you'll be able to do that. But the final area you're able to go to once you get your Ornithopter is the Deep Desert, which is the primary play space of Dune Awakening, at least in its size. And the Deep Desert is going to be 9 stitched together zones that are going to be massive. It's going to be like 9 times the Conan Exiles map. And each one of these stitched together zones is hosted on a different server, meaning they can have a lot more people in each area. They want hundreds, potentially up to like 500 people in one area, meaning you could have 100-person battles because the Deep Desert is fully PvP enabled, except this small strip that once you enter the Deep Desert, you'll be put there so you can't be attacked right away. But everything else in the deep desert is PvP enabled, and you could freely travel between all these different zones that are stitched together. They're just on different servers, so they can all have their own different player counts. But the biggest element of the deep desert being that it is always fully enabled PvP. So the deep desert being this massive area and being essentially a more endgame area being fully PvP enabled would generally make you think that, oh, you're gonna have to PvP to get, say, the higher tier resources, or to get a lot more resources, meaning you kind of have to do it, or to farm, say, higher tier schematics or something like that. And there is going to be a big reason why you don't actually have to step foot in the deep desert at all. But even outside of that element that we'll go over, the deep desert being this massive means that you will still be able to be a PvE focused player and still go to the deep desert and generally avoid other players, especially since there's going to be a bunch of different vehicles you have access to. Like, you could have an ornithopter, you could put a bunch of modules on it to make it better at flying or faster, or carry more weight if you're trying to focus on farming and not focus on PvP. So there are a bunch of different elements that you can combine together to make it so you can much more easily avoid PvP in the deep desert. And there's also some other elements that make the deep desert even easier to run around in while being able to avoid PvP. The first one being that the deep desert is wiped on a weekly basis. A Coriolis storm comes through, it wipes away all of the player buildings, so you can't permanently build there, which also means there's not going to be as many bases you have to try to avoid when going around the deep desert. But also it'll change up all the content available within the deep desert. So it could change up resource spots, it could change up dungeons, it could fill a dungeon with sand that was accessible this week, and the next week it won't be accessible, and a new one will be accessible somewhere else. It can change up points of interest. The reason why that wiping away and changing of the map is so important, especially if you're a PvE focused player, is because this means there could be different areas that other players don't really know about for that week, or it's not super common. And because it's going to be different on every overarching world, it's not necessarily going to be super easy for any other player to find like a really good spot that you can farm at without being told about it from another player, or them just exploring and finding it like you did. That just gives PvE focused players an easier way to avoid PvP and still have good farming areas, or good areas to go get resources from, or good dungeons to go farm. And on top of that, there's also going to be cartography. Now this means you'll be able to create actual maps in game and map out all of the different points of interest and resource locations on a map. Now, since the deep desert is wiped away and reset every week, this means every week cartographers can make new maps, but that will take a good amount of time as described by the developers. So you could also be a PvE focused player that either goes and buys a map from somebody that likes doing cartography, or you could do it yourself, try to find really good farming locations or really good points of interest that are maybe more out of the way, use that cartography skill, and then go find those areas for yourself and try to find the best areas to avoid all of the PvP. Because again, the deep desert is so massive, it's not going to be super easy to say go find some specific player and try to farm them or stop them from farming a specific area. It's so massive that you're kind of just going to come across what you come across. Now, this has been looking at the deep desert like a PvE player that wants to still go there but doesn't really want to partake in PvP, kind of wants to skirt around it and be able to get all the better resources and schematics and things like that while being in the PvP area with just trying to ignore as much PvP as possible. But if you're a player that just doesn't want to do any PvP, you can still stay in Haga Basin and the social hubs and still be able to obtain pretty much anything other players are able to obtain from the deep desert. And the reason for this is that pretty much everything, or most of the things in the game, will be able to be sold or traded to other players. And there will be a player auction house or a player market in these social hubs. So you as a player that only does PvE, that's only in Haga Basin, could get good at building bases and blueprinting them and selling those. You could just be really good at farming up tons of resources and making base vehicles or base weapons or other base resources that PvP focused players will always want. Or you could be somebody that primarily focuses on farming all of the content you have in Haga Basin and getting the more rare schematics or elements out of Haga Basin and focus on farming those and selling those and being able to build up your own personal wealth or currency within the game. This will allow you to go buy any of the resources, any of the schematics or anything like that is accessible only through the deep desert. And this is a bit unique compared to a lot of other MMOs because most other MMOs have items that you can't sell. If you go to something like World of Warcraft, tons of stuff you can't sell. You can't sell pretty much any of the best gear in the game. And then you have a variation depending on what other MMO it is, depending on how much stuff you can sell or what stuff is soulbound. Dune Awakening, especially a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, seems like you can just sell pretty much anything. So if you can sell and buy pretty much anything, you're able to still obtain everything from the deep desert being a PvE focused player. You just have to focus on farming things that people will want to buy from Haga Basin. And you still should be able to also farm some spice and farm a lot of different resources, even some endgame resources. Deep desert is going to be much better for all of that. And then because of how schematics are going to be working, it seems like there will be deep desert specific schematics as well. So those schematics or the items you craft from those schematics, you would need to go there. But again, you can just buy those from other players off of the player market, allowing you to still access everything in the game, even if you're not a PvP player that's going to go to the deep desert. And being a PvE focused player can even extend into the very end game of systems, specifically something called the Lancerad, which is going to be a decently big part of the game. So in Dune Awakening on launch, you'll be able to choose between two different factions, the Atreides and the Harkonnen, and you'll be able to choose to join either of those. And then there'll be a weekly Lancerad that they've been explaining as a bingo board. So basically different NPCs will give you objectives they want you to complete, and then they'll give you their vote in the Lancerad, which will basically just give you, say, one of the squares on a bingo board. If you want your faction to win the Lancerad that week, you need to get bingo. So while the other faction is trying to do this bingo board, you may want to do this one and then this one to try to get bingo first. And whoever wins the Lancerad gets to vote on a server-wide rule that can help that faction for the week. We've heard of a couple rules, one being a full loot PvP for the deep desert for a week, one being your faction gets crafting cost reductions for a week. So there's a bunch of different like server rules that winning the Lancerad could give you. And the reason this is also important for PvE players is because the Lancerad's objectives aren't just deep desert things. They're things throughout the entirety of the game, and they're basically just objectives to get you to go do content, to point you at things to do that week. One of the objectives could be they want you as a faction to turn in like hundreds of ornithopters. You being able to build your first ornithopter before you can actually get to the deep desert means a PvE focused player that only stays in the deep desert could just farm up the resources to craft tons of ornithopters. That could be what they're focused on for that week. If they focus on that and they win that slot on the bingo board for their faction, that's as much or potentially even more than a lot of the PvP focused players could be progressing towards in that week. So even the most deep endgame and generally considered PvP content can be interacted with by purely PvE focused players. And I think another really big element is going to be base building and base raiding, because something that's really unique with Dune Awakening compared to other PvP survival games in Haga Basin is where you're going to be building your permanent bases. Like I mentioned, the Coriolis storm comes through and wipes away the deep desert every week. That wipes away all the player buildings, meaning that's not going to be your permanent base locations. You can still build in the deep desert, but it's going to be gone in a week. So they're generally going to be more for controlling areas. But in Haga Basin, you can build pretty much permanent bases. You do have a shield generator that protects your base from sandstorms or other things hurting your base. And if I'm not mistaken, you can have like 20 days of protection in your shield generator. So if you get on once every 20 days and refill your generator, you basically have a permanent base. And having a permanent base in a PvE focus area where you basically can't be raided is actually a really massive departure compared to games like Conan Exiles or Ark Survival Evolved or Rust, because playing on PvP servers in any of those games, your base can be raided at pretty much any time. In Dune Awakening, you have this PvE area that's really large with a lot of content. You have your pretty much permanent base that really can't be raided by other players. And then you have full access to everything or almost everything that can come from the PvP focused deep desert because you can just buy it from other players. So if you're really a PvE focused player that really does not want to partake in any PvP, you will be able to do that in Dune Awakening. Now, I'm definitely not saying it's going to be the most optimal. I'm definitely not saying you're going to be able to easily obtain everything from the deep desert just by buying it from other players, but you will have access to pretty much all of it just being a PvE focused player. But that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.